This video is all about the things that people tend to get wrong about Vancouver. There's 7 myths or misconceptions that honestly I feel are basically BS. They're just not true. And we're gonna look at every single one of these myths and break them down for you one by one. Be sure to stick around all the way to the end to make sure that you understand what the reality of living in Vancouver is today. Let's get into it right now. My name is Sebastian Albrecht with the Living in Vancouver BC team, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. This channel is all about living in and moving to Vancouver. And today's video is all about the things that we get wrong about Vancouver, the myths, the fallacies. And myth number 1 is that Vancouver is boring. One of the nicknames that Vancouver has earned over the years is no fun city. And honestly, this is one of those fallacies about Vancouver that I feel is based on a distant past. My own family immigrated to Canada and moved to Vancouver in the 1960s before I was born. But some of the stories that my parents tell me, my dad in particular, my dad was a fun-loving, vivacious, outgoing person. He, coming from Europe, honestly did find Vancouver incredibly backwards, incredibly quiet. But that was because the city was a provincial backwater in the 1960s. There really wasn't a lot going on. You couldn't buy booze in the city on Sundays, as an example. You couldn't go to a bar on a Sunday. When I was younger, through the 1980s, I remember, and I think this is something that a lot of people who, base this nickname, this is where this nickname came from, is that was a period where Vancouver was booming and growing. And honestly, I think we kind of got ahead of ourselves a little bit. And so we lost a number of festivals and events and sports teams. One big festival that was huge in the 80s was Oktoberfest or Seafest. Those were 2 big festivals, and both of those shut down. They just couldn't continue. We also lost the Molson Indy and the Vancouver Grizzlies. One thing I think that people will find really surprising these days, especially coming from other parts of Canada and the world, is until not that long ago, we didn't have a happy hour in Vancouver. In British Columbia, you weren't allowed to discount booze. And that's something our liquor laws, our liquor code has been modernized and upgraded. These are all things from the past. The truth is that today, Vancouver is a metropolis of nearly 3 million people. Sure, on the grand scheme of things, it's not globally the largest city out there. It's relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but for Canada, it is the 3rd largest metropolitan area in the entire country. It's one of the major cities on the west coast of North America, and there is more going on in Vancouver than ever. We have countless festivals and events. It's one of the main destinations for concerts and comedy shows in North America, in Canada, I should say. It's quite often that, music acts will come to Vancouver and sometimes not even go to Calgary or Toronto. Toronto is the biggest center, of course, and the biggest draw, but if there's one other city in the entire country that these concerts and events go to, it is Vancouver. On top of that, we have excellent restaurants. Our food scene is phenomenal bars. Sure, it's not New York City, it's not Toronto, and it's not Berlin. It is a much smaller city, and you have to kind of come here with appropriate expectations, but for its size, there is a lot going on here, and it's definitely a place where you are not going to be bored. And aside from all of that, there's also the natural beauty that we are surrounded with. And so there are a lot of people that come here and enjoy the nightlife, but aside from that kind of fun, there's an amazing opportunity outside of the city that we are just on the frontier of, and it's right at your doorstep, and you're within 30 minutes from downtown Vancouver to complete and utter wilderness. And that's an enormous amount of fun for a lot of people. So is Vancouver boring? No, it's absolutely not boring. This is a fun place to be. Myth number 2 is that Vancouver is not safe, that it is a crime-ridden city that is dangerous and you need to be really careful coming to Vancouver and definitely living in it. Now, I do find this it depends on what your perspective is, right? If you're coming to Vancouver from a small town in Alberta or in Saskatchewan, in relative terms, there is more crime in a city like Vancouver. But on the grand scheme of things, globally and definitely also nationally, Vancouver is a very safe city. We sort of rank in the middle of crime statistics nationally. And then in terms of the crime severity index, we are actually well below the average, and as crime severity increases in the rest of Canada, it's actually decreasing in Vancouver. Since 2013, the crime severity index in Vancouver has declined 12.3%, and it's increased nationally 22%. It may not indicate the amount of crime, but what it's indicating is that the kind of crime is shifting. And something that I talk about quite a lot on this channel is that the kind of crime that we have an issue with in Vancouver is petty crime. And so it's things like something, your car perhaps getting broken into, if you live in a condo building, having your storage locker broken into, you know, riding your bike downtown, locking up your bike and then going up into an office tower for, I don't know, a dentist appointment or something, and coming back down and your bike is gone. These types of things are risks of living in Vancouver, absolutely. But we don't have issues, even with somebody asked me earlier today whether it was necessary to have a home alarm in Vancouver, whether that was a good deterrent. And honestly, like even break-ins in houses aren't really an issue in Vancouver. In 25 years of owning a house in Vancouver, I've had my house broken into once in that entire time. I had a laptop stolen at that point. That's the only issue that I've ever had. I know that my parents, I think in about 50 years of owning a house in Vancouver, have had their house broken into twice. And so this isn't really a problem in Vancouver, even, you know, so I would say petty crime at the very low end of the crime scale is fairly common, and it is pretty much driven by the drug epidemic, homelessness. So people that are really desperate for a quick injection of cash, they want to get their next drug fix, and they're looking for easy pickings. They don't want something complicated. They're not criminal masterminds, that's the word that I was going for. And they're not planning these crimes. They're crimes of opportunity more than anything. And then in terms of real severe physical crimes that are going to be harmful to random individuals, those are very much rare and on the decline. There are many stats to show, as much as the media kind of, you know, I would say there is a bit of fear mongering in the media, and, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. So these types of crimes are really pushed to the forefront of our media. We do live in a big city, 3 million people. And so there are outrageous crimes that do happen, but they're not typical, and they're not an epidemic, and they're not something that touch most people in this city. So is Vancouver safe? It is 100% one of the safest places you are going to find in North America and in Canada. In fact, you know, one of the big draws, I think, for people, like, I don't even need to think about whether my kids are safe at school. We live in an incredibly safe city. I don't worry about walking the streets at night. My wife, if she's out for a drink with her friends, without me, I don't worry about her safety. It's sort of peace of mind is something that you definitely have when it comes to crime in Vancouver. Myth number 3, Vancouverites are not friendly. Honestly, I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Honestly, I don't really know where this myth comes from, because it's not the reality of the city that I see or that I have experienced. And I am a lifelong resident. I was born and raised in Vancouver. I see it amongst the people that I grew up with. And to be frank, most of the people that I grew up with don't live in Vancouver any longer. They have moved away. They live in places like San Francisco or Toronto or Calgary, or in the suburbs of Vancouver. Very few still live in the city itself. But those who do, I know that they have a very diverse group of friends and a very diverse group of experiences. One of the things that I do hear quite a bit is that it's much easier to make friends with newcomers to the city than it is to make friends with the people that were born and raised here. And I would say that's probably true, and it's probably true of every city. But if my experience is any indication, and the experience of most people that I talk to, it's very rare that you go into a room, let's say you're at a party, it's very unlikely that out of 50 people, there's more than 1 or 2 people that were born and raised in Vancouver. If you're talking about, you know, people 35 to 55 and that kind of age demographic. And so the reality is, you're not making friends with people from Vancouver because they're not really in Vancouver any longer. All of us tend to be from somewhere else. This is a city of immigrants. I think if people are struggling making friends, it's more to do with it speaks more about them than it does about the city itself. There are many opportunities to make friends and people want to connect. And certainly, in recent years through COVID and beyond, more and more people want personal connection. Vancouver is a city, I would say, where people do have, as I've spoken about in other videos, there are a lot of people who have passionate hobbies. People live here for a work-life balance. And so much of people's sort of social circle revolves around these hobbies. And so people connect around running or cycling or board games or, I don't know, watching Premier League soccer, whatever those hobbies happen to be. And typically those hobbies tend to be more physical and active things. If you are struggling in Vancouver to make connections with people, get hobbies that are social and interactive and active hobbies. And I think you're not going to find that Vancouver is as cold as the myth of Vancouver is. This is a city where there's plenty of opportunity to find your niche, to find your people. People are open to connecting. And that has been my experience and the experience of people that I'm connected with and that I speak to as well. So is Vancouver a tough place to make friends? Are Vancouverites unfriendly? Absolutely not. That is myth number 3. Myth number 4 is that it rains all the time. And along with that is that it's really dark. I feel like this might have been a myth that we kind of created to keep other people away from Vancouver. Because the truth is, yes, Vancouver does get more than the average Canadian city in terms of precipitation. It is in the upper half of that range, but it isn't the city that gets the most amount of rain. The rain that we do get, the precipitation that we do get is actually all concentrated in the winter months. So from mid-November through to April or so, we get a fair amount of rain. And there definitely are periods where, it's raining every day. And you may not see the sun for a couple weeks because of the cloud cover that gets socked in by the North Shore Mountains. But the truth is, we also don't tend to get a lot of rain at once. We don't get enormous torrential downpours. It's just very consistent and steady. And the rain tends to be pretty light. So most Vancouverites, those of us who are born and raised here, don't actually own umbrellas. Like, I don't own an umbrella because it's more of a hassle to own one than is the benefit of owning one. Because we don't have those huge torrential downpours, I just have a really good raincoat and I wear that out. And if it starts to rain a little, well, often I don't even put my hood up. But if it starts to rain a little more, then I put my hood up. And that's more than enough cover for most of the rain that we get through the winter months. The rest of the year is incredibly dry. So through the summer, late spring, all of summer, and early fall is a very dry period in Vancouver. The other thing I think that you really need to be aware of is there's a vast difference in geography of how much rain you're going to find you get. There's areas where we see almost triple the amount of rainfall, North Vancouver, for example, then some areas that get nearly a third of that amount of rainfall. Delta, Tawasin would be those areas, White Rock as well. So there's an enormous difference. It's not all uniform. Vancouver is, Metro Vancouver is a very diverse geographic area. So there are parts of Metro Vancouver that get actually far less rain than Toronto does, or other parts of the country. And then there's parts of Vancouver, North Vancouver, that get significantly more than the average in Vancouver. And those are things you're gonna wanna be aware of. In fact, I've done a video just on the weather that I think you may wanna watch. Be sure, I'm just gonna link it right up there for you. Check that out if you wanna know more and all about Vancouver's weather. Myth number 5 is that Vancouver's traffic is amongst the worst in North America. Well, honestly, it kind of depends. On the whole, I believe that's a myth. It's not true. But it does depend on where you're moving from and at what time of the day. As I talked about in a recent video, Vancouver is very much reliant, our transportation system is very much reliant on a network of bridges. In order to connect many of our municipalities one to the other, we're crossing bridges to get across some of the major rivers that sort of intersect our region. And the result of being so reliant on bridges is that they can really significantly impact commuting times and your ability to move from one place to another. If there is a traffic jam, if there is, basically some road construction, or there's a jumper on a bridge, or some other police incident for one reason or another, a bridge is shut down or sort of bottlenecked, well, a commute that might take 30 minutes could take an hour, could take an hour and a half. But our region is crisscrossed with different ways of getting from one place to another. It's a very small, in relative terms, geographic area. And on top of that, we have many alternative ways of getting from one place to another aside from the automobile. So yes, if you are solely reliant on an automobile and you need to get from one corner of Metro Vancouver to the other corner, you are going to curse the traffic and you're going to have a bad day, more likely than not. But that's going to be true of any city of Vancouver size or greater, whether it's Toronto or Montreal or Seattle. You know, all of these cities have issues crossing from one side to the other. But honestly, traffic in Vancouver is much, much lighter than all of those cities. Part of that is because our city is geographically smaller and we have excellent alternatives to driving a car. So we have a phenomenal public transit system, especially if you're living on a SkyTrain line or along the West Coast Express. It makes commuting a whole lot easier. But there's other alternatives. And if you live close enough, walking can be an option because the city of Vancouver is quite small. Taking an Uber or a car share or a bike share or just riding your own bike on a bike lane, all of these are really viable options for a lot of people that live in Vancouver. And so people are seeing alternatives to being stuck in traffic. So is Vancouver traffic horrible? Is it amongst the worst in North America? No, it is not. Is it something to be avoided? Absolutely, but there's plenty of ways to make sure that you can avoid that. And if you want to avoid a long commute and you're thinking of moving to Vancouver and thinking of buying a home, well, you're going to want to talk to a realtor like myself who has helped hundreds of people move to Vancouver and find just the right fit. If that's you, if you're thinking of moving here, be sure to reach out anytime. We can begin a conversation about your move to Vancouver and where might be the right place to live so you're not spending all day in traffic. Now let's get back to the video. Let's talk about the economy. Myth number 6 is that Vancouver's economy sucks, that it's really hard to find a job. The truth is, Vancouver's economy is more diverse and resilient than it's ever been. It's one of the largest economies in Canada, a major contributor to economic driver in all of Canada and on the west coast of North America. We successfully, in my lifetime, made a transition from being a primarily resource-based economy to being primarily knowledge-based. As a kid, Vancouver was basically a logging town and a mining community. Those were the drivers of the Vancouver economy. In recent years, Vancouver very consistently is one of the fastest growing economies in all of Canada, according to the Conference Board of Canada. It is officially Canada's gateway to the Pacific Rim. It's a major port. It's one of the most active ports in Canada and one of the most active ports on the western coast of North America. It's the main western terminus of the transcontinental highway and rail routes. Most of our economy these days is based on trade. Film and TV is an enormous contributor. You wouldn't believe how many TV series are filmed here. Everybody seems to be an actor or involved in TV and film in some way. The main reason is the Canadian dollar is cheaper. We're known as a result as Hollywood North, and a lot of Hollywood productions come up here to the north, also because the Metro Vancouver region can kind of double as many areas in North America. If you want to film in New York City, but it's too expensive to do that, well, you can film in the back alleys of New Westminster and it looks very similar or passable. If you want to film in, I don't know, North Dakota or something, well, you can film out in Langley and you'll get a similar feel if that's what you want to do. So aside from film and TV, also technology has become a huge industry in Vancouver with huge multinational conglomerates like Microsoft and Google, Salesforce, all moving major headquarters into Vancouver, in the Metro Vancouver area. Tourism, of course, for a very long time has been a big part of Vancouver's economy, as well as we all know, natural resources such as logging and mining, and then construction. Real estate is a backbone, one of the major contributors to our economy. Definitely there's been a boom in construction over the last 30 years. So our economy is more diverse and is growing incredibly in Vancouver. It's also incredibly resilient. And so over the last 30 years or so, where we've seen the economy in other parts of Canada waver, Vancouver, does waver a little bit, but it kind of keeps on chugging and keeps on going. There's a little stutter in the step, but then it continues. And that's been the experience of Vancouver over the last 30 years. I expect that to continue for the next 30 years as more and more people move to our region and bring their business ideas and their drive and resilience to our city. And myth number 7 is that Vancouver is completely unaffordable. How can we get through any discussion about Vancouver without addressing the cost of living? It feels like that's all that people want to talk about, but the reality is it's not a completely unaffordable city. There are opportunities for just about everybody to survive and thrive in Vancouver. Let me get into it. Most of the expenses that we find in Vancouver are very similar to what they are everywhere else in Canada. What I find the people that are most upset about the cost of living in Vancouver don't realize how much the rest of the world has changed. Cost of living everywhere has risen dramatically. And one example of this would be that Vancouver was just recently ranked as the second most expensive city in Canada, and the one that surpassed it for the typical family, so an average family with 2 kids, is actually the city that we think is one of the most affordable. That's the city of Calgary. There are some things in Vancouver that are cheaper than they are in other cities. Some of those things are, surprisingly, property taxes. Our property taxes are quite reasonable. You pay a lot more for the same value in most other places in North America. And certainly Toronto's property taxes are way higher than what you'd be paying for a similarly priced home in Vancouver. Utilities are also very, very cheap. The only place that is cheaper than British Columbia for electricity is Quebec. So we have very good value when it comes to utilities. Our utility bills are not that bad at all. And the other thing is sushi. We have great sushi and it's super cheap. It's one of those things that's such a luxury in other cities, but in Vancouver, it's just everywhere. It's like buying, I don't know, French fries or something like that. There's a real war when it comes to good quality, cheap sushi. So those are 3 ways you can save money when you're in Vancouver. But there are a couple things that are more expensive in Vancouver, and you should be aware of that. Number 1 is gasoline. In all of the Greater Vancouver regional area, in Metro Vancouver, I should say, we have a TransLink levy, a tax that goes onto gasoline that helps to pay for the transportation infrastructure in the region. And as a result, our gasoline prices are considerably higher than what they are everywhere else in Canada, and actually in North America, I should say. And it's typically about 30% higher than what you're going to find in the rest of Canada. So be aware of that when you're coming here. It's one of the reasons, again, you might want to think of alternatives to driving, and definitely you don't want to be driving a big gas guzzler if you want to be saving some money. The second thing that's pretty obvious, I think we all know, is the cost of housing. Whether you're renting or buying, owning or renting a place is expensive in Vancouver. There's no 2 ways about it. And headline numbers are staggering, right? The affordability is a real issue. But the truth is, there are some ways to mitigate what those expenses are. And so if you're looking to purchase, one of those ways would be living further away than you otherwise would, or living in something more modest and smaller than you otherwise would. So buying a condo, as an example, in Surrey, you could buy a 2-bedroom condo for, what would be a relatively modest amount in the grand scheme of things. Locals will argue with me in the comments below, I am sure, because they're thinking about what those condos used to be and how much money that used to cost. But the truth is, the world has changed, and Vancouver is such a small city that has so much intense demand. We need to build a lot more supply to satisfy that demand before prices are going to adjust in any kind of meaningful way. But in any event, there are sort of options to look for more affordable housing. Not everybody is going to be able to afford a single family detached house in what would be considered the best neighborhoods, because that is what everybody else is trying to buy, and that is where the prices are the highest. Now, other ways that people can end up saving money would be sharing housing. As I said, living a little further out, living in, rather than a brand new condo. And so these brand new condos, when we're talking about an average rent for a 1-bedroom, that typically is the number for a 1-bedroom brand new condo or a very new condo. So around $3,000, $3,100 a month would be what it is in Vancouver. But the truth is, you could be renting a place in Vancouver that, you know, might be $2,000 a month. It would be considerably cheaper as a one bedroom. In order to save money, the other thing people look at is smaller spaces. So if you're an individual, do you really need a townhouse? Do you really need a 2-bedroom? Perhaps a smaller 1-bedroom is enough. Maybe you don't need that extra den. These are all ways that people are able to save money when it comes to housing. And one thing I think people really do forget is that in BC, we have a rent control. If you sign a lease, the landlord is only able to increase the rent once you're in a place by a certain amount. So if you live there for 30 years, you're not afraid that your rent is suddenly going to get jacked up because there's greater demand for your kind of housing. And that's not the case in a place like Alberta. There is no rent control. So if you are a landlord in Alberta and the market gets stronger and stronger, you can jack up your rent for your tenant from $2,000 a month to $2,500 or $3,000 or whatever the market can bear. That's not something that that renters in Vancouver have to experience. Now, there's other downsides. I understand that, you know, there are rent evictions and landlords are getting, finding ways to kick out tenants, but there's plenty of protections for those tenants. And it's honestly really, really hard for landlords to get away with it any longer. And if they get caught, the penalties are massive. They're paying, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. They're paying an entire year of rent back to the tenant as a penalty. So most landlords understand what the rules are and they're living by those rules, and most of the tenants understand. And there's some really good protection if you are renting in British Columbia and Vancouver specifically. So is Vancouver unaffordable? No, most of our expenses are exactly what they are in the rest of Canada. There's a few things that are cheaper, and then there's a couple things that are more expensive. One of them is a pretty big, massive expense, of course, but there are some ways to mitigate that cost. So if you are thinking of moving to Vancouver, keep that in mind. I've got one last bonus for you, and that's the myth that Vancouver is perfect. The reality is it's not. There's lots of things wrong with it. There's imperfections. I mean, we can point to the housing crisis, the fact that rents have skyrocketed in the last couple of years. We can point to drug addiction and homelessness. You could point to crime if you wanted to. There's lots of things. I mean, some people hate the bike lanes and they would say, what a stupid city because we have all these bike lanes and we're catering to the wrong people. Well, all in all, Vancouver, I personally think, is doing a great job navigating the issues of a modern city. And if we look to other similar cities around North America, I can't think of one that is doing a better job, really. I'm proud of calling Vancouver home. I love this city, but I understand that it's not perfect. And you don't want to be moving here thinking that it is absolutely perfect. You want to understand some of the issues, but you also want to understand that some of the things that people complain against most of Vancouver aren't quite what the reality of the city is. And that's basically what the point of this video was. I hope you get a better understanding of the reality of Vancouver after watching this. And I appreciate you watching all the way to the end. Thank you so much. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to hit the subscribe button and hit like if you got value out of this video. Come back next week. I put out videos just like this one every single week about living in and moving to Vancouver. And of course, if you're thinking of moving here, if you're thinking of buying a home, be sure to reach out anytime. My contact information is right there on the screen. And before you run away, I want to see you on my next video. There's a video right here I think you're really going to enjoy, and that's all about Vancouver secrets. They're all the things that people don't tell you before you move to Vancouver. So be sure to check out that video. I'll see you over there.